Hi everyone, my name's Justin Campbell. Today my guest is Jared Cooney Horvath, and he's the author of this fantastic book, Stop Talking and Start Influencing. It's one of the best books I've ever read on this subject, and to be honest, I've read a lot. I've read a lot of the big titles on influence, and also I've read some stuff on memory as well. So I really appreciate you agreeing to come on this chat so we can discuss your book in more detail. So I guess my first question for you is, why did you write it? Why did you write this book, and who's the intended audience?
Oh, perfect. So I was originally actually a teacher back in the day. So when I first started writing this book, what I was trying to do was put together 12 principles of human learning, specifically for teachers. So I could say, look, if you're running a class of year 6 kids, here's how they learn so you can start to have a bigger impact with them. But the more I I didn't know a book took that long to write. I thought I'd be done in a couple months. Ends up stretching it about 2 or 3 years till you finally finish it. And in that time, I started to do more work with trainers in business and started to work with footy teams and coaches. And I started to realize that, wait, we're all learning. The learning principles don't stop when you leave the classroom. It is everything. If you're in sales, if you're in marketing, you're trying to get information across to people in a way that sticks. That's learning. So it started with teachers, but it's since expanded to coaches, parents, sales, marketing, trainers, anyone who's in any capacity where their job is to get information to others in a way that helps change them. If that's you, then you're who I wrote this book for. Make your job easier.
Well, I'm an account manager. You know, my job is to help people understand the benefits of the product, understand that they could be doing things better, influencing them in that way, just to basically and help them sort of retain the knowledge. Because so when I go out to meetings, I'll often just dump knowledge on people. And there was a lot in your book about helping people not just hear it but also retain it.
Yep. And I think we're constrained a lot of the time by that format where it's like, well, I only have 1 hour with you. So our natural inclination is info dump, see you later. And unfortunately, if you've ever been to a conference, you know those things are fun, but 2-3 days later, you don't remember anything from it. You maybe have one idea, the rest just disappears. So if we know, and that's totally natural, that's due to the human learning process. So for that kind of idea, you can assume we have this thing called a forgetting curve. Take 80% of everything you learn today, no matter what it is, new, old, whatever, you will forget 80% of everything you learn today within the next 3 days. And over the next week, it'll probably drop another 10%. We're just not meant to hold on to things. But luckily, because we know that, we now know that 10% you do hold on to, what was unique about it? Why that 10%? And once you learn those rules of what makes that stuff sticky, then you can start to apply that to any information you want and say, all right, if the brain tends to hold on to X, Y, Z, how do I embed that, utilize that knowledge to make my information resonate with that? So that's the stuff that sticks with them. So that's this is going to sound like I'm blowing sunshine up my butt, but I don't mean to. But whenever I'm at a conference, I'll have the presentation that people talk about like a couple weeks later and like, oh my God, I saw the best presentation at this thing. And everyone asks, how did you do that? And I go, it's just, there's no accident to it. I'm just following the rules of learning. I'm just riding the rails that are already down in people's brains. And the only reason they remember my stuff and not yours is because I'm playing the rules. You didn't take time to listen to the rules, so it's okay. It's not that your information was better than mine or worse than mine. It's just I presented it in a way that resonates with how people learn.
That's incredible. There's so many people who knowing what those rules are could benefit. I actually pinched some of your material for an internal work thing, and I talked about distributed practice. And the way I described is what people want. I called it the Matrix method because if you remember the movie The Matrix, Neo got plugged into the chair and he had the knowledge of how to do kung fu and fly a helicopter downloaded to his brain.
Just download the helicopter, go. Oh, I love that. I wish believe it or not, that was when I first started down this field. I worked in brain stimulation, and my thought was, can I hack the brain to actually upload information into it. Unfortunately, the answer to that has come out a very strong no. So that was about 5 years of my life that I won't get back. But I love that concept, that idea of how can I get it in just so easy for you.
And unfortunately, this is what people want. When people request training and you to come out and talk to them, they often want it in a format that that's just downloads it to their brain, and often they'll want to do it. They'll also want to be multitasking and doing all kinds of other things while you're doing it. And unfortunately, I think what I picked up in your book and other things I've read is if you actually want to learn something, you really got to be willing to make that investment and plan out how you're going to do it.
Rule number one, and it's not in the book but I think it's obvious, like you just said. You only remember what you pay attention to. That's it. You don't devote the attention to something. It's never going to stick. And so there are examples where you get subliminal messages but you don't understand that, that stuff might stick, but it's subconscious, which means you can't access it and do anything with it. So I might be able to sneak an idea into your head, but if you can't consciously use it, who cares? Who cares that it's in there? So one of the big rules, I think, of any learning, as trippy as it sounds, or as easy as it might sound, is you got to learn how to play people's attention. Rule one, if you can't get their attention, everything else is going to go out the window. Now, once you have their attention, that doesn't mean they're automatically going to learn. Like, I just watched Thor on TV last night. I watched that film. I was enjoying it. It had my attention for 2 hours. I couldn't tell you anything about it today. So I had my attention, but I didn't learn from it. So attention is where you got to start, but you can't stop there. Once you have it, you're not done. That's when you start playing with these learning principles and say, now that I got you, what can I do to make sure this sticks?
In the book, I think you call that the David Attenborough effect. Is that right?
The Attenborough effect, this idea that engagement doesn't actually mean learning. And we got that. We actually did it a study. So if you've ever watched those David Attenborough docs, like Planet Earth 2, so good. If you haven't seen it, watch it. When you're watching it, you swear you'll never forget that stuff because it's so engaging and compelling. But if we have a group of people watch one of those, then have another group of people watch a lecturer just dryly say the dialogue. So no images, just takes the word from Attenborough and just speaks them. The people who watch the show love it, engage, swear they'll remember everything. People who watch a lecture, they hated it, they're bored, they're not going to remember anything. A week later, guess which group remembers more? The group with the lecturer, the dry lecturer. It was like all that excitement, all that engagement of the show fooled people into thinking they were learning, but they weren't actually learning. The lecture taught them better than the show. So don't ever confuse engagement with learning. Play both together. That doesn't mean don't engage people. Just means be ready to play both of those cards together.
That kind of relates to the concept of recall, doesn't it? Because we're not very good at judging whether we're retaining things or not, because I'd say most of us who went to uni, we kind of relied on the review as our most common method, and yet that's a really poor method of trying to retain our knowledge.
Well, just think, most of us got through college. We all passed our tests by rereading chapters, putting information in. But I guarantee you, most of the people watching this, myself included, I don't remember 99% of things I learned in college. So it was in there long enough to pass a test, but it was never actually in there. It's gone now. So this issue of how do we form deep, lasting memories was a big one that we tried to tackle for a long time. And our first thought was, of course, emotions. Okay, if an event is emotional, you'll remember it better versus if it's neutral. But that doesn't really make a heap of sense. Otherwise, why do we remember radio jingles and Lucky You're with Amy? Why the heck do I know that? That's not emotional. That's not meaningful. So emotions can't be the real story. So then we thought, okay, it's just pure repetition. Just keep putting it in and the memories get bigger. But then you think of something like, and this is going to sound strange, but the Apple logo. Is the top of the Apple logo have a stem, a leaf, or a stem and a leaf? Now, this is a logo most people have seen thousands of times, but they can't really. So we've put this information in, but a lot of them can't really answer that question well. Or what does a $5 bill look like? Or what does a $1 coin look like? We can't get it. So it can't just be pure repetition either. Turns out the secret we figured out of forming a deep memory, it's not about how the information goes in, it's about how you take it out. Every time you access a memory, pull that out of your head, recall it, that makes that memory deeper. Access it again, it makes it deeper. So the big secret is we only need to put in information once. If I can get you to do the work and start pulling it out, recalling it, whether that's quizzing yourself, teaching somebody else, describing it to a friend, debating it, that's what's going to make the memory deeper for you. And that's why if you think about it, that's why I like Game of Thrones. I've watched it once, but I could tell you everything about that show because I recall it all the time. I think about it. I talk about it. I debate about it. I look up fan theories online. I'm just always accessing that information. So it's as deep as a memory is ever going to get in here. So recall is key. You want deep memories? How are you pulling it out?
Well, in the book, you've got a quote. We don't think about what we remember. We remember what we think about. And I think that sums up that whole concept of recall perfectly.
Bingo. You know what's interesting? Go back to the memory, to the emotional one. We've since learned that the reason why emotional events are so memorable is we have a trigger in our brain that makes us recall emotional events the night we go to sleep and the next morning after we've gone through them. So the reason we remember emotional events isn't because of the emotion, it's because we recall it more than non-emotional events. So we're right back to that idea of recall is the only thing that drives memory.
Interesting. That's really that actually makes a lot of sense. But it's one of those things that scientists had to spend decades studying
to come up with a common sense. Somebody recently just published a research paper that says dogs can understand human emotions. And it took 5 years and millions of dollars of research money to come up with an answer that anyone who's ever owned a dog just went, yeah, no shit. We've known that forever. So it's science lagging behind common sense. But once we have it, now we can confidently say, yep, you were right.
Not all common sense ends up being correct. So it's good there's
That's
people
true.
out there verifying things. So I guess we've talked about recall. So I guess that relates to another chapter in your book, which is distributed practice. So would you like to explain the concept of distributed practice and how people can apply it?
Yeah, absolutely. So go back to that idea of the learning curve, this concept that there's just too much information gets in during the day. There's no way we're going to hold on to it all. So when we learn something or when we practice something, if we try and cram that all into one day, there's just not enough time to consolidate, hold on to all of that. We're going to lose a lot of it. But if you take the same amount of practice or study and just split that across several days with sleep in between, all of a sudden the same amount of practice can boost your memory 60% for up to 6 months longer. So instead of, like, if you cram today 5 hours of study, cool, you're going to forget a ton of it. But if you do the same 5 hours, just an hour tonight, an hour tomorrow, an hour the day after that, what happens is every night when you go to sleep, you consolidate those memories. That's when we're tying memories down. And the next day when you come back for your next hour of study, what's the first thing you have to do? Recall what you did the day before. So by just spacing it out, not only are you allowing memories to get tied down, but you're forcing recall, which makes everything so much better. So I always say a lot of learning is contextual, so there's a lot of wiggle room to some learning principles. But if there was ever one thing we found that's as close to a law of learning across the board in any animal, plants, bugs, it's distributed practice. Do things over several days, and everyone remembers more, deeper for longer. It's just the simplest thing you can do. Which is funny that when you think back to conferences, these 2-day learning marathons where it's like 16 hours of info, worst way to learn. If you did that same conference somehow, and I don't know what it would look like, spaced out day by day by day over a month, trust me, people are going to hold on to that a lot better.
Well, on that note, you do have a Udemy course where you go through these concepts, which would allow you to to space out and rewatch your courses.
And what's good with the Udemy one too is you'll start to see. I always practice what I preach. So there's a lot of stop points in between where you're forced to recall, where I stop everything and I say, here's a concept, write down as much as you can remember about that concept. So there's a lot of recall circularity, and there's a lot of follow-up. If you take any of my courses, for about the next 2 months, you always hear from me. Like 3 days after the course, you'll just get an email with 6 key principles, and it'll say, okay, read each principle, pull up as much information as you can. So I follow up with you because I know that's where the memory is going to stick. Over that next 2 months, if I can get you recalling, playing with this information every 3 or 4 days, you're in. You're never going to forget it.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So we've talked a lot about the memory aspects of it, but you start off the book using an example of we can hear someone in a crowded pub, but we often can't really hear someone when we're in a quiet meeting room and they're doing a PowerPoint and all that kind of thing. Why is that?
So it turns out, so if you think about it, like in a crowded pub, right, there's a ton of noise coming in. And the way the brain works, we have enough space to process all of that noise. So we can hear all of it. But we have one part of the brain, it's typically on the left. For some of you, it's going to be on your right. But we'll call it the language area. And we only have one of these. So what happens is when we have a voice we want to pay attention to, that voice gets funneled into that language area, and we can pay attention to that, hear it above all that other noise. So that's why we can listen to speech. So if I'm talking to you in a pub, I'll hear all this, but this language area will say, focus on that voice, and it'll make it crystal clear for me. Now, unfortunately, so now go into a meeting where we've got a presenter and they've got a PowerPoint slide with words. Unfortunately, when we try to silently read, the way the brain processes our silent reading voice is the same way as though we were speaking out loud, listening to ourselves speak. So if I could image your brain while you're silently reading, I'll see the parts of your brain that process sound activate, and then the language area kick in. Because your brain thinks when you're reading that, oh, someone is speaking to you, and it processes it like a voice you want to pay attention to. So what happens is, because we only have one language area, if I try to silently read, so read a bunch of PowerPoint slides or a handout while someone is trying to speak, I now have to choose which of these voices I need to pay attention to, because there's only one language area. So is it the speaker or is it my silent reading? It's a bottleneck. It's one or the other. And what tends to happen is, so in an ideal world, you just pick one and block out the other, fine. But what tends to happen is people try and jump back and forth between them. So I'm going to do some listening, do some reading, do some listening, do some reading. What happens is once you start jumping back and forth, you start to lose information from both. And people who jump back and forth between reading and listening remember so much less than people who just either read and blocked out the voice or listened and blocked out the text. So for us as teachers, what this means is if we're teaching, if I'm verbally going to be teaching you anything, the one thing I want to make sure is I'm not also forcing you to try and read. Because A, you can't do it, and B, when you try to, you're actually losing information from me. So you might worry that it's boring or something. Trust me, it's not. People will learn better if you just speak with them, use images, use actions, use stories, fine. Do not force them to read while you're trying to teach them. Will never work.
It's funny because I'd kind of learnt this concept, but I didn't actually, until I read your book, I didn't understand the reason why. Because years and years ago, I bought a book, there's a book, Presentation Zen, and then there's another book, I forget what it's called, the presentation lessons from Steve Jobs. But anyway, it's basically looks at what Steve Jobs did with Apple, and you'll notice all Apple presentations, which everyone's copied now.
Yep.
There's usually a giant picture in the background, and it's him just talking on stage.
Because there's no bottleneck. So there's bottleneck between words and speaking, but there is no bottleneck between images and speaking, which is why TV works. You can see images and listen to speech without, and in fact, not only do they not clash, they come together in sensory integration and actually boost your comprehension and memory. So I don't know if he did it on purpose or did it intuitively, but exactly that is knowing that, cool, I'm going to weave a narrative while you're looking at a relevant image, and you're going to remember so much more than one or the other. Or if I just put up PowerPoint bullet slides behind me.
Well, it's got big implications for not just how you do your presentation, but also the handouts you give out and when you should give out handouts. Because you talk about that in the book, that because a lot of people do that. They want to seem sort of professional and they give handouts when they do a presentation, and guaranteed people will be looking through those papers and be distracted.
And even worse is, and we do this in the classroom a lot, which is our mistake. So aside from handouts, sometimes we'll give out, say, practice problems. If there's one thing human beings can't stand, it's an unfinished problem.
Right.
So I guarantee you, just test this out. At the next meeting, put a bunch of pieces of paper with open questions that just says question 1 with like lines for them to answer. I promise you, before that meeting even starts, most people will start filling in those answers. They just can't stand to sit there with a problem that you say, we'll get to that in about 10 minutes. Just ignore that problem. They can't do it. They'll be filling it out. They'll be circling it. They'll be doing whatever the heck. So aside from just wordy handouts, be careful of all handouts. If any handout is a worksheet, be prepared. When you give that out, be ready for people to do it. So don't give it out until you're ready for people to be focused 100% on that sheet.
Mm-hmm. And this segues pretty nicely into, you've got an entire chapter dedicated to multitasking. But basically the short of it is that you can't multitask, don't try.
Oh, I wish we could. Yeah, if you think about it, anytime you want to do a task, the way I always kind of conceptualize it is you have to have a rule set and activated for that task. And what that rule set does is it sets your attentional filter. So it determines what is allowed into conscious awareness and what gets blocked out. Now, unfortunately, you can only carry one rule set at a time. You can only have one attentional filter. So anytime you try and do two things simultaneously, technically you can't, because they have different rule sets, they have different filters. So the best you can ever do is really quickly jump back and forth. So you can never actually multitask, but you can task switch quickly. And the problem with that is every time you jump between tasks, like we were talking about with the voice, you end up losing information. Like the last second of what you were doing when you jump tasks just gets wiped out. Doesn't get stored, doesn't go to memory, it's just gone. So the more you jump, the less you learn. And all of that memory starts to get processed. I won't go into the science behind it, but in a very different, weak memory network. So not only are you learning less, but you're learning it in a way that makes it very hard for you to access it later. So it's like if you could imagine, and this is an oversimplification, but if you can imagine we have a conscious memory network and a subconscious memory network. The more you multitask, the more the conscious network just starts to kind of wither and shut down, and the more the subconscious one comes on. So information gets in there. If you ever see it again, you can say, yep, I've seen that. But you can't really recall it. You can't pull it up. It becomes almost inaccessible for you. So there's never a time when multitasking is a good idea. And just to put some of your listeners out of their misery, if you're watching this and you're thinking to yourself, oh, well, I multitask all the time. Yes, we can multitask. So we can drive a car and sing along to the radio. But we can only do that when one of the skills we're doing is on autopilot, when we're not focused to it. So we're not actually using the rule set. We're just running our program for that. So when you're driving the car and listening to the radio, your driving is on autopilot. You're not actually focused on that. You're focused on singing, which is why as soon as you need to find a street address or a parking spot, the first thing you'll do is turn down the radio, because you need to activate that autopilot to find what it is you're looking for. So you can multitask so long as one task is on autopilot, and in which case you're not actually doing any learning. But when you actually want to learn something or do something well, multitasking is a horrible idea.
Right. So another concept you talk about in the book is chunking, and I think the chapter is called interleaving.
Yep.
So, do you want to explain what that is and how it's helpful? And
yeah, so I think a lot of people, if you've heard of the term chunking before, a lot of people think it's an input method. So if I'm trying to teach you stuff and I chunk all that stuff together and give it to you, you can learn it better. And that's very true. But the true point of chunking isn't an input method. It's an output method. It's not how does information come in. It's how do I store it and access it later. So what tends to happen, if you think about it, I like to think about it kind of like tying your shoes is the easiest example I always come up with. Is tying your shoes is a completely complex thing. And it requires so many steps. Grab the laces, right over the left, right under left, pull. And when you're a kid, or if you have a really young child and you watch them, they're doing each step in turn. You can actually see them think. First hold, then bend, then go. The reason we don't have to as adults is the more you do a series of actions or patterns again and again and again in sequence, what the brain does is it eventually says, wait a second, all of these individual skill sets that I'm using, they always keep appearing in the same pattern. Tell you what, make that one skill set. So rather than storing 12 steps to tie your shoes, squish that into one shoe tying chunk and just make that one thing in the brain. So now when you and I tie our shoes, it literally is a single program that once it starts, it just runs to the end and we're done. Which is hilarious because if you ever get stopped halfway through tying your shoes, you almost always have to start from the beginning. You go back and you go, shit, where was I? Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. Same thing with your phone number. If somebody says, what are the last 2 digits of your phone number? Most people will verbally go through their entire phone number because we've sequenced those numbers so much, it's just become one unit in our brain, one chunk. So we can use this to our advantage. If there's ever a skill or a procedure or a series of information that we really need people to know, then what we want to be doing is drilling it in that sequence as much as possible. Form the biggest chunk we can form to make it as automatic and simple. When you start, boom, just let the thing roll out. But sometimes we don't want people to chunk. We form accidental chunks. So if you play golf, I've been practicing golf. When I go to the range, I tend to do all driver, like maybe 20 driver shots. Then I'll do all 3-iron. Then I'll do all 9. Then I'll do all putting. And what's happening is because I keep practicing in the same way, my brain is starting to chunk all of that. So I always do driver first, 3-iron second, 9, then putter. And it's turning it into a chunk, which means when I get out on the golf course where I never do that sequence, it's harder. My performance is going down because I'm finding it harder and harder to say start with a 3-iron or start with a 5-iron because that's not how I've been practicing. So sometimes we form accidental chunks, and that's where interleaving comes in. If you know you're practicing a set of skills that you don't want to blend together, you want to be jumping and mixing and matching in between as you're practicing. So rather than doing 10 drivers, 10 9-irons, you do 2 drivers, 1 9-iron, back to a driver, over to a putter, 3 over here, 5 over here. You just keep mixing and matching so your brain never says, well, there's a big pattern here, let's chunk it. The brain just always keeps each individual chunk separate. And believe it or not, when you're practicing like that, it feels weird, it feels hard. But once you actually go to perform, trust me, you're going to notice the difference. It's going to be a lot easier for you to perform.
Yeah, because when we are doing something, what feels right is often to do a whole bunch of the same thing in one go.
Yep.
Yeah, and also we often feel that we're learning, like say going back to the concept of reviewing. We often feel like we're learning something by just rereading it, and so these two concepts of having to recall something and applying the distributed practice, plus also interleaving how you do things, is hugely important.
Well, think about recall. Bring recall into it. So if I'm practicing, say, 10 drivers, 10 9-irons, 10 putts, I only have to recall that skill set once. Driver is on, and now I'm just doing it. 9-iron is on, and now I'm doing it. But when I interleave, not only am I making sure nothing is blending, but every time I jump, I have to store and then recall the information. So I might have to pull up my driver skill 6 times in a practice session rather than just once because I just keep jumping back and forth. And that's making the skill better, deeper, stronger. So you start to see how all 12 principles, although I introduced them as individual things, it's all one big learning pattern. They all are speaking the same language. And once you kind of see how they fit together, it's like, well, now the pattern makes sense.
Yeah, I definitely took that from the book. I definitely felt like I started to understand how the human brain actually works. Rather than it being a computer or something like that. So and kind of there were a lot of similarities between the different concepts that seem to be going back to some deeper core principle of how the human brain actually works.
Which is, you're spot on. It's not a computer. We used to think it was all input and processing. And really, we'll use that metaphor a lot now, but that's not an accurate metaphor. It's not an input device, and it's certainly not purely a processing device. It's a creation device. And it's a prediction device as well. So the more we can kind of tap into those patterns, like I said earlier, we're riding the natural rails of the brain. So it's easier to learn and remember when you're following the rules or playing the rules that are naturally in there.
Mm-hmm. And what impact, I guess, related to predicting, what impact does error have? Because you've got an entire chapter dedicated to error. So what is error? How does that impact influence and how we learn and all that sort of thing?
Best way to learn anything is to screw up. And a lot of people say this: fail fast, fail often, but there's a very specific reason for it. So if you think the brain, a good concept for the brain is an all-purpose prediction machine. So essentially the brain, its base pattern is to take in new information, to learn stuff, turn that into a prediction, and then simply live in that prediction, just run the prediction. So right now, everyone listening to this, they're not actually listening to us speak. They're about 1 to 2 seconds in front of us predicting the words that are going to come out of our mouths. And that's how the brain saves energy, and that's how we live. We live slightly in the future. And if you ever see animals, they don't. If you ever see young babies, they don't. And that's why we always say, oh, they're so present, because they are. They're not in a prediction, whereas we're just living our simulation. The easiest way to get somebody out of a prediction and into the present moment, to open them up to this moment and say, time to learn something brand new, is error. By its very nature, when you commit an error, when your prediction fails, when there's a big enough discrepancy between your prediction and reality, you don't have a choice. Your brain flips into a mode we call theta, and essentially you're in the present and everything is now primed to learn. The whole system goes into learning mode and says, fix this discrepancy, tell me how to solve it. So the more we can, rather than avoid errors, the more we can embed errors into our teaching and learning, the easier time we have to say, cool, you've made your prediction, you've seen how it's failed, now here comes some fixes for you. And the brain will sap that up. It's like a sponge. It will just soak that stuff up. And so if you think about it, go to feedback now. And this is actually really, really good for any trainers. If you're talking about feedback during learning, any effective feedback needs to have 3 things. 1, where am I going? 2, how am I going? 3, where to next? Where am I going? That sets their prediction. You thought you were doing X. How are you going? In reality, Y. Your prediction says this, but reality says Y. That triggers their error alarm, kicks them into the present. And then the third bit of feedback is where to next. Now let's start to fix that. That's why feedback is so effective for learning when done correctly. It taps into that error process. So never be afraid of errors, man. Errors are the best way to learn and think.
Fantastic. That's yeah. I mean, there's just so many concepts in here. I mean, we could go on and on, but probably, I guess, where can people actually pick up your book? Where's the best place to buy it?
It is available everywhere. So it's on Amazon, it's on Booktopia, it's at Readings, it's at QBD. So I've lucked out. I have a good enough distributor that it should be in all major outlets.
Nice.
And if you ever just happen to bump into me around, I sell them for much cheaper than you'll get them in a bookstore. I just give you my author discount. So if you just happen to bump into me, I'm your guy as well. But it's all over the internet, so you should be able to find it, fingers crossed.
Fantastic. And I just need to, what's the title of your course on Udemy?
Oh, yeah. So it's called The Neuroscience of, I want to say presenting. I think it's, here we go. Give me 1 second. Because I think it's called The Neuroscience of Presentations and Public Speaking is the new title. And so it's actually really, I really love it. So it's about 3 hours all chunked out for learning. And you'll see pretty much everything I talk about, I live it. So you'll see it all in action. And the way the course kind of pans out is the first hour is on human thinking. And then after that, we then use PowerPoint to kind of dissect the first hour. So I essentially give a presentation where we all learn a lot and go, oh my God, it's incredible. Then we dissect that bit by bit to show exactly why we were doing what we were doing, why this was working, why do I have these on my slides. So it's actually, I enjoyed the heck out of it. I had such a fun time putting that together. So if you're ever interested in presenting, there you go.
Well, I'm very interested in presenting, so I'll definitely be a customer, and I'll leave you a good review, no doubt.
Oh, thank you. And remember, for everyone, Udemy always has, we were talking earlier, has a high price. Never pay the high price. If you always go back the next day, it'll be 98% discount. So most courses you can get for 10 to 12, $15. So anytime it's too expensive, just go back in 24 hours. Trust me, we'll fix it.
And you can get the app on your phone. It allows you to download it, so there's no excuse. You can
enjoy it whenever.
The course is available whenever. Well, thank you very much. It's been very informative. So I really hope people go out and read the book, because you know, there's a lot more in the book, and the way it's laid out, I mean, every chapter is followed by tips for presenters and influencers. So it's the information is incredibly accessible, and I got an awful lot out of it. So thank you very much. That was really good.
Thank you so much.
All right, great. All right.